Hello, it's me, Craig. Hello and welcome to Flooded. It's much I'm not coming out on speakers. Nice to see you. Good morning. I was browsing TikTok this morning and I came across a channel called The News Agents, all one word, which is a podcast that's done by a group of people who used to work at the BBC in the news department. And I came across one of their TikToks, and I'm going to play it to you right now, if I can just bring them up. Here it is. This chap here is Lewis Goodall. There's also Emily Maitlis and John Sapel. Kind of senior, respected journalists, ex-BBC, but also ex-other companies as well. So let's just listen to it, and I'll tell you why I want to talk about it.
The BBC, Robbie Gibb, made my life really difficult day after
Robbie
day.
Gibb is the former Director of Communications for Theresa May, who then went to be on the board of the BBC.
Former communications.
And also helped found a rival broadcaster, GB News.
Yeah, exactly. And, not really talked about this before, he made my life really, really hard at the BBC. Day after day, I would hear from people saying, just watch it, Robbie's watching you. Now, because they had created this sort of confection that somehow I was sort of Labour supporting or, doing Labour stuff. By comparison to Robbie Gibb, my sort of grand summit within the Labour Party was, vice chair of Birmingham Northfield CLP and youth officer when I was 17 years old. And I'm sitting there going, hang on a minute, I'm being lectured about impartiality from a man who until checks notes like 12 months ago was literally head of comms in Downing Street. When I was at the BBC, Robbie Gibb.
So that's it. That's the TikTok that I saw. And it just it set me off a little bit because I know a little bit about what was happening at the BBC around the time of Robbie Gibb. Robbie Gibb was very much someone involved with the BBC. They didn't quite share exactly what he did because he actually was he did other things too. I'll show you. Looking here, he was he was born like 1964. He was a former editor of BBC Sunday Politics and the Daily Politics. He was head of BBC Westminster, overall charge of BBC political programme, Sunday Daily and Sunday Politics, the Andrew Marr Show this week in Radio 4's Westminster Hour. Prior to joining the political team at Westminster, he was deputy editor of BBC Two's Newsnight. During the 2016 EU referendum, it was a campaign. Gibb was editor of The Great Debate at Wembley Arena. He also edited BBC's 2017 general election debate. In August 2020, it was reported he was leading light behind GB News, a leading light, a new television channel which has been licensed by the broadcasting regulator Ofcom, and many claim and say is a right-wing news organisation, or their output is predominantly right-wing, and I would agree that is true. In April 2021, it was reported that he joined the BBC board in 2021 as the member for England, following his comments about following his comments about woke and endemic bias in entertainment output. He sought to block Jess Brammer's appointment to a role overseeing BBC news channels over concerns that Brammer, a former editor of Huffington Post, would damage relations with the government. I won't read any more because you get the idea. So people are being employed at various places who have political biases. But it is pretty easy to not be politically biased or not present it to the world. The viewer should not know where you're coming from politically. Now, Robbie Gibb fronted the Andrew Marr Show, and the Andrew Marr Show, Andrew Marr is pretty left-wing, I would say. So, and then the Andrew Marr Show got taken over by Rob Burrell, I think, who is now, he's left BBC, clearly left-wing, looking at his Twitter activities. So the point I'm making is that there's something happened at the BBC. They made a horrific mistake round about the time that all the other channels were starting to do quite well. And the mistake they made was they panicked. The BBC, I joined the BBC in 1997 and this was a time when the internet was just starting to happen, mobile phones were starting to happen, and everyone saw the potential of what was to come, which is that broadcasting is going to go in the way of the internet. That means everyone and their uncle can be a broadcaster, probably from their living rooms. And lo and behold, look at me! I'm broadcasting from this castle that I live in. I live in a castle. It's a canal boat. It's not a canal boat. It's a castle. That's what's happened. So the BBC panicked. And now, when I was at the BBC, when I worked there, this rather grubby-looking book, the Producer Guidelines, was given to everyone who joined the BBC. Look at the old logo there. And if you open it on the menu, look at that. Look at the BBC's values and standards. Page 2 of this book is impartiality and accuracy. Page 2. I've already jumped to page. That's not right. It's chapter 2. A factual program dealing with the controversial public policy or matters of political or industrial controversy will meet its commitment to due impartiality if it is fair, accurate, and maintains to a proper respect for truth. So the BBC, right. This doesn't mean the BBC can't get out truths about bad things that politicians do. It doesn't mean that. It just means they can't say it. You need to get other people to say it. And then if it's controversial, if there's a debate about it, you need to get that other opinion as well. You can't just it's like products. You can't just say one product. Here's a Hoover. This is clean your houses with Hoover, folks. No, Hoover is a brand. You've got to get another vacuum cleaner and say, well, these ones are also just as good and equally priced. And we all know that. I've also got the BBC Handbook from 1956, which is the first one, I think. So I'm researching it. Right? So, the BBC were having a bit of a problem. Now, you've got to bear in mind that around about this time, I can show you, I've sort of been documenting all this. I've done like a timeline of what's happening when. I'm going to hide that because stuff in there I might not want you to see. my career and my schools and things. But I've been documenting it. And Channel 5 was launched in 1997. Mobile phones came about. BBC Knowledge came around in 1999. We got Amazon Prime in 2005, YouTube 2005. So all around about the 2000s times, things were being set up to cope with these new developments in technology that were changing how people were being entertained. And watching stuff on the internet wasn't really a thing. Because even when something like Netflix launching in 1997, that was a system of them sending you DVDs. You'd get sent a DVD in the post if you wanted to watch a film. That's how they started. So it's very interesting. But what was happening in television was that we were moving away from the proscenium arch type entertainment. Comedians who were, they were getting rid of all those type of comedians. A lot of the stand-ups used to doing light entertainment were all finding themselves struggling. They all moved into, so all those comedians all moved into like proper acting and in things like sitcoms and soap operas and stuff like that. BBC started doing EastEnders. Over Channel 5, which had just emerged, were doing very edgy. They were off air a lot of the time, but they started doing like quite edgy stuff. They were putting late night naughty films on, I think. That's how they started out. And they were trying desperately to get the advertisers to come on board with them. Eventually managing some years later to do 24/7 television, I think. And if I remember, up in Scotland, they didn't get Channel 4 or Channel 5 for years after they were launched. Over on Channel 4, between 1992 and 2002, there was The Big Breakfast, Vic Ree's Big Night Out, Harry Enfield, The Word, all that kind of stuff. Doctor Who got axed. Bottom became a thing as a spin-off from The Young Ones, kinda. And then later on, there was Curb Your Enthusiasm, League of Gentlemen. The Office. All these things were new and edgy and different to what we'd seen in the 80s. Because in the 80s, we'd had Spitting Image and Saturday Night Live, Last Resort, Alexei Sale, Blackadder. Things were moving away from that. And the BBC was hoping to keep up with new opinions, new views, new generations, going into universities and trying to keep young audiences. And this happens like every 25 years or maybe even like 10 or 15 years. That everybody starts thinking a different way. So what the BBC did was it decided that rather than do what it had been doing, which was most of its staff, it made everything internally. It hired lots of producers, lots of directors, researchers. It decided to, while maintaining all those people, let's hire in some freelance exec producers. So I worked on a show called All Rise for Julian Clary, and they brought the producer from, I think, Vic and Bob in to do that. And that producer arrived, and she was in the office at top of, on sixth floor. And I was like, I think I was the only BBC staff researcher working on that show. And she was smoking in her office. Smoking was banned around. You can't smoke in the building, but she didn't care. And they let her because they were like, oh, please work for us. Do edgy television for us. We don't know how to do it. And she would smoke. And then all the researchers got permission to smoke. She was a friend of Chris Evans. So she was very, very loud, very brash. She had sort of gone into television without any sort of formal training. No skills in managing people at all. Talked to you however she liked. Swore like a trooper. And me and like my BBC training and everything, I was like, ooh, what the hell's going on here? And everyone was just like very badly behaved, basically. So I worked on that show, and this was like eye-opening. And I remember having to go to speak to HR to say, look, what should I do? I'm like desperately miserable working in this team. She wouldn't let you go out if a story. She wouldn't let you go home if a story was like had fallen through. I had to go. I was supposed to go to a dinner date. She said, "No, you got to stay here and find another story." I was like, "No," told to get lost, and I went anyway. So there was lots of really bad behaviour going on, and that was just happening sort of across the board. And it was also happening in BBC News because I'm trying to remember the name of the guy. It will come back to me. BBC News started hiring Guardian journalists or editors to be editors of the BBC News and BBC News shows. I can't remember the name of the guy who came over from Channel 4. Channel 4 was always seen as being quite sort of a left-wing bias, I think, an alternative to the stuffy BBC. I think a lot of people sort of think of the BBC as being conservative, but then again, I think a lot of people think of the BBC in terms of the news as also being very lefty. So I think like you're probably doing quite a good job if you've got 50% of the people saying you're left wing and 50% of people saying no, you're right wing. Because if you're left wing, you're sitting at home enjoying what you're watching, and then suddenly a right wing talking point gets raised, and you like makes your blood boil. It's like what? And then if you're left wing and you're sitting watching the BBC show, and then a right wing talking point. Did I just say this? No, yeah, yeah, you know what I mean. If you're conservative or you're right wing, and then a left wing talking point gets raised, your blood boils. But the point is that if they're getting complaints from both sides, it's probably a good thing. I think. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I think probably, possibly. And that's what. And that's what's kind of like been happening at the BBC. Now, the point I'm trying to make was that this stopped getting drummed into people as they started hiring the funky new folk from Channel 4 and then The Guardian and all the badly behaved, edgy shows where, people, there was no skills about managing people, and it was, and that's where the edginess came from. What can we get away with? And it's good. That is good, I think, for broadcasting generally. Pushing the boundaries is good. But the dear old BBC still had Terry Wogan and all these old fogies making their shows. And brilliant broadcasters. I've just dismissed them, but these are brilliant legends, really. And the BBC started running scared, I think, and stopped drilling home the importance of impartiality. And I want to stress why impartiality is important. If you are left-wing, if you vote for a left-wing government, and your main broadcaster, which has several channels, pumped into every household around the country. All those households are paying, by the way, £156 a year. If you're pumping into those houses left-wing talking points, dismissing anything the Conservatives say, then that is potentially going to massively influence how people are going to vote come election time. Now, we know that there used to be, when newspapers were still a massive thing, there used to be a massive scramble with people running for Prime Minister or the parties running to get into power here in the UK. A massive scramble to get Rupert Murdoch on your side. Can I get the Sun to support my party? Can I get the Daily Mirror to support my party? And it's I'm not really sure where they are politically now. I think the Daily Mirror is probably very left wing, but Sun's probably right wing. I don't know. I know Daily Mail's right wing. I mean, we can do that, and I think I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's okay to have a political bias if you're a news organization, as long as it's kind of declared and obvious. I don't think it's bad having Fox News and CNN in America, because one sort of counters the other. But what you can't have is your national broadcaster. If you have a broadcaster who is middle ground, and when they do, when they present a show to you, they're saying, this is what one side is saying, and this is what the other side are saying, or you hand over to one side and you get them to argue it out at a desk on some sort of news show, and then the perspectives are coming from them and not you. It's not your opinion, it's their opinion. Then that makes sense. If you are going to do something that's like a feature, which is going to have analysis by you as a journalist, you need to support it with opposing voices. And you might think, well, that sounds very boring. But what happens is it builds trust. And that's what impartiality is all about at the BBC, is like getting the British public to trust this broadcaster is not dropping propaganda on them. So back to that TikTok. Let's just think about who these people are, right? So the BBC's most senior journalist gave off the record note presentation to global tobacco giant. In two statements, Philip Morris International said the terms of John Sopel's speech. There he is. So when John Sopel went to America and became the BBC North America editor over there, he would have been paid to come and do this corporate event for the people who make cigarettes, Marlboro, etc. And there he is doing his speech. Now, at the time, this was kind of... by the way, I'm reading something by Mark Stefano, who I do not rate at all. It says, BBC, one of the BBC's most high-profile journalists, John Sopel, delivered an off-the-record keynote address to executives at tobacco giant. It was kind of like it wasn't kind of, nobody really knew he had done that, but things leaked out onto Twitter. People at the event were sending out pictures and stuff. And the point is that he is allowed to do that. John Sopel's allowed to go and support companies that give you cancer if he wants to, right? And it's not, BBC staff are allowed to do that. He declined to comment. But I'm just telling you, that is, you might think, oh, that just means he's a massive capitalist. But he's not. Emily Maitlis used to be... So John was at the BBC and he left. Emily Maitlis was at the BBC and she had allegations of lack of impartiality, allegations. And it's in a Newsnight discussion concerning Brexit. It was alleged that one viewer, that Maitlis had been sneering and bullying towards columnist Rod Liddle. Maitlis had accused Riddle of writing columns containing consistent casual racism week after week. Now, it could be that she was absolutely right, but that doesn't matter, because what matters is that she's impartial about it. She is not... if there's criticisms towards political leaders, it has to come from other people. That's kind of the point. But Rod Liddle isn't a political leader, but it's not her place to See, that complaint there, which is consistent casual racism week after week, is kind of criticising, he's a political columnist. And it's kind of what Labour were saying. I don't know. But that's not what caught her out. On the 27th of May 2020, the BBC said that Mateless's introduction to Newsnight the night before, which discussed the allegations that the Prime Minister's chief advisor, Dominic Cummings, had contravened lockdown restrictions. Rather than me read you any more of that, here it is. Let me go full screen with it. This is her intro.
Good evening. Dominic Cummings broke the rules. The country can see that, and it shocked the government cannot. The longer ministers and Prime Minister tell us he worked within them, the more angry the response to this scandal is likely to be. He was the man, remember, who always got the public mood, who tagged the lazy label of elite on those who disagreed. He should understand that public mood now, one of fury, contempt and anguish. He made those who struggle to keep to the rules feel like fools and has allowed many more to assume they can now flout them.
See, I won't play any more, but that's about half of her intro. This is written by her, and what she's done there is, it sounds to me when I listen to it that this would be better coming from somebody else. She is saying this is the BBC's opinion about him. He flouted the rules or whatever. Now, he may have done, that may be absolutely true, but it would be more balanced if we had somebody there saying, he flouted the rules. It's obvious and it's clear. And then somebody else says, no, he didn't really because of X, Y, and Z. Now, you might think, well, that's stupid. He clearly did. Then you kind of probably don't like Dominic Cummings. You don't like the government. You're probably anti-lockdown, things like that. But there, as we all know, there's a polarized view about all of these things. When I saw this and I thought, oh, that's definitely in breach of guidelines. This is not what we're taught to do as BBC members of staff. And what had happened was, I think, that basically, as the new guys came along, they just stopped caring, or they just wasn't drummed into them well enough. We can have a look back at Emily's career. Where does she come from? Well, she's, this is according to the trustworthy Wikipedia, which is all cited, so as long as you check the citations. She appeared in Question Master and National Lottery in 2005. So remember I was saying around about 2000s, BBC was starting to panic. Mateless appointed contributing editor to The Spectator, which is, I think, actually, that's a balanced, I would say that's a balanced newspaper. 2012, she presented the US 2012 election coverage on BBC One. Where did I see something that was kind of interesting about her? Transfer of sovereignty of Hong Kong. Yeah, so she basically joined the BBC. She joined Newsnight alongside Kirsty Walk, blah, blah, 2006. There you go. So she sort of came around about the early 2000s. In 2019, she was amongst the highest paid BBC News and Current Affairs staff, receiving a salary of $264,000 in July 2020. Campaign group Defund the BBC ran billboards highlighting Mateless's salary and that Gary Lineker with the heading, Are you still paying? Are you still paying? Defund the BBC, which is generally thought to be like a right-wing organisation, I guess. So, I don't know. People are starting to think it became quite easy to sort of know how BBC presenters were, and news readers and news anchors and journalists, how they voted. It became obvious, to me, and it's always like a personal opinion. You know, there's no facts about this in terms of it being, you don't know for sure. It's like, well, no, you never know for sure, but you have a feeling, that person's probably like, pushed to one direction, and it's kind of always through slight inferences, and also when they're interviewing somebody, how they steer the conversation rather than keep it balanced. They hone in on something that's like which tends to be personal to them. And then you've also got the chap from the video, Lewis Goodall, BBC impartiality row, Newsnight policy editor accused of off-the-scale bias. Lewis Goodall wrote a piece for the New Statesman which had the cover line, "How the Government's Ineptitude Created a Lost Generation." So here's Lewis. Lewis. I don't want to call him Goodall. I don't want to be rude. He's a respected journalist. If you like left-wing journalists, if that's what you want to trust. I can't trust him in terms of what he's saying, because I think that he's not telling me the whole picture half the time. I think he wants me to believe a certain direction. He wants me to vote a certain way, because in a way it's kind of like an activism that's driving their journalism, and that kind of like ruins it for me a little bit. But I suppose a lot of journalists are like that. The BBC's at the centre of a fresh, make it bigger so you can see it, impartiality row after Newsnight's policy editor wrote an article for a left-wing magazine attacking the government's handling of the exam crisis. Lewis Goodall's piece of New Statesman was billed on the cover as an examination of how the government's ineptitude created a lost generation and headlines. So he's basically criticising the government, saying that they're inept. They always have been. The government are led by technocrats. And then you have... And you got section 4 of this is the bang up to date BBC guidelines. BBC is committed to achieving due impartiality in all its output. This commitment is fundamental to our reputation and our values and the trust of audiences. The term due means that the impartiality must be adequate and appropriate to the output, taking account of the subject and nature of the content, the likely audience expectation, and any signposting that may influence that expectation. Due impartiality usually involves more than a simple matter of balance between opposing viewpoints. We must be inclusive, considering the broad perspective and ensuring that the existence of a range of views is appropriately reflected. It does not require absolute neutrality on every issue or detachment from fundamental democratic principles such as the right to vote, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. We are committed to reflecting a wide range of subject matters and perspectives across our output as a whole and over an appropriate time frame so that no significant strand of thought is underrepresented or omitted. And I think that is it. And they have to do it. They have to do it. And it's good that they do it. It's one of the few organizations in the world presenting news that basically everyone kind of trusts. I'm glad to say that to a certain degree they still do. Now, Robbie Gibb is absolutely a conservative, I would say. He's right-wing, I would say. But he's from a generation that believed in the rules of impartiality. And I think that when Robbie Gibb was in charge of the Andrew Marr show, we were getting that. We were getting balance. And he was in control of that. And it really doesn't matter if these people in charge are right-wing or left-wing in their own heads. It's about creating the balance. And the question is, does Robbie Gibb do that? And the fact that he, here he is, he tried to stop somebody get a prominent position. The BBC is very much sorry, you can't see what I'm looking at there. The BBC is very much kind of like the government have a lot of say in what the BBC does, and I think it's the government who chooses the board. And if you look at the BBC board, you'll find that it's a mix. It's a mix of Conservative and Labour, and people from all sorts of different political backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds. So to Robbie Gibb, it's absolutely his right to get involved in who is selected as the head of BBC News. That's their job. If you look it up, maybe I can show you it. BBC board. Let's get it up on the screen. About BBC board. Let's make it nice and big so you can see it. So the BBC board. The board is responsible for ensuring we deliver our mission and public purposes. It does this by setting the strategic direction. The strategic direction for the BBC. Now that has to involve who are we having running the BBC News? Who is that? That has to be part of the strategic directive. A creative remit on the BBC's editorial and creative output services, budget, framework for assessing performance, framework for, this is what they do. And here's the members here. And you can look all these people up. They're all like different backgrounds. Muriel Gray, she's definitely lefty. Where's Robbie Gibb? There he is. Let's look at Muriel Gray. She's responsible for holding and protecting the independence of the BBC. She's a definite Labour supporter. Who else have we got here? I don't know any of these other people really. Robbie Gibb. Yeah, I would say this is a smart guy who may have even if he did GB News. People like GB News, I think, is predominantly right wing, but I think that we are at interesting times, and GB News certainly has been a breath, kind of, maybe not fresh air, a breath of fresh air. Maybe they could use a mint, but they were. It's certainly you're hearing things that no other broadcasters talking about. So in that way, it's good. Now, when balance returns to, the political balance returns and everyone stops being far left or far right and all the moderates start building again, then hopefully GB News will start to struggle, to be fair. As one of the, who was he? He's also responsible for ensuring that the BBC fulfills its mission to inform, educate and entertain and promotes its public purpose. Non-executive directors play a key role in ensuring the BBC maintains the highest standards of corporate governance, particularly with respect to financial reporting, internal control, and risk management. Blah, blah, blah. He was director of communications at Downing Street. Somebody from Peston went on to become the director of communications at Downing Street as well. Now that's kind of a lefty show. Anyway, I think you're getting my point. Hopefully, I'm making a point here, which is that don't believe what you hear. There are all those three people who are now part of the News Agents podcast. They are all pretty much, I think, embittered ex-BBC staff, to be honest. I think they're just bitter. Here they are. And the whole reason they're talking about this is because...
But I guess the other question it raises is whether or not you're in step or out of step with public opinion. Is Gary Lineker, who is a football commentator, he's the lead presenter of Match of the Day, allowed to voice his opinions? Well, it seems that in some cases he is. When he was leading the World Cup coverage for the BBC in Qatar, he opened the coverage with thoughts and questions about Qatari human rights abuses. And he did so with the BBC's blessing. And we'll remember, they didn't even cover the opening ceremony. They allowed that platform.
So the point about this, Gary Lineker is as one of the highest paid people at the BBC. He's contracted with the BBC, always sharing his political opinions, always anti-Tory, which is fine. This is absolutely fine. But it breaks this impartiality thing. People are paying the BBC to be impartial. BBC has to be impartial. So he can't. Now, why you see that story there, that thing about Qatar, everybody I think was in agreement about the human rights problems with Qatar. So I don't know. It would be an interesting conversation to be had. Is it persuading people to vote one way or another in this country? What's he being one-sided about? There are key human rights issues around Qatar. The left know that, the right know that, everyone's in agreement. So I think it's kind of different. Although, if there's a big football match going over there, it's probably fine, I think, for him. I think it'd be worse if the BBC ignored it in a way for both sides. I think everyone in Britain would be annoyed if it was ignored. So, but if it was a general election and he was talking about, and we were all about to vote whether Conservative or Labour should get into power again, and all he did was rubbish Labour all the time, or rubbish Conservatives all the time, I think some people would have an issue about that. I don't think everyone in the country would be absolutely fine about that. So it's kind of different. But they're also just not getting the point of what impartiality is, why it's important. They're sort of arguing that, well, if he was okay to do it then, he should be okay to do it now. No, the point is that he was either not okay to do it then. You know, maybe he should have been sacked for that Qatar thing. He definitely should be sacked for any political opinions he's given outside of his contract, especially because he's been told so many times to not do it. And he's agreed, I think it's in his contract to not do it, for social media, to be balanced in your social media. And if it's not in their contracts, it should be. And anyway, my sort of final point, or my final thought about this, is that the BBC would benefit from just getting rid of all these millionaire presenters. Don't hold on to them. You don't need to be scared anymore. Become a world-class broadcaster again. Train people, make the stars, don't hire them. And make it so that it's affordable to the whole country. We don't really care about you getting big celebrities in to present the shows. Don't worry about the ratings and stuff like that. You'll get the ratings as long as you're... If something happens in the country, everyone needs to be... everyone will turn to the BBC to find out, what's the real story? Who's going to have the best coverage? And it needs to be the BBC. It should be the BBC. And at the minute, people are probably turning to Twitter to find out where's the real story, because it just gets the news out there faster. So become a world-class broadcaster again. Start finding new talent, train them up. And if they want to leave after a few years, like say, I can get £1 million if I go to ITV. So well, go on then. Bye. We'll train somebody else. We'll find somebody else. You know, the BBC shouldn't be paying over, 250,000 for a presenter or something like that. 250,000, by the way, is probably what John Sopel got for 20 minutes work. When he was talking about, he was encouraging everybody to smoke cigarettes, allegedly, or whatever one is doing when they go to a William Morris AGM, whatever it was. Anyway, that's a long and rambly live, no editing version of my view about that. It is more about BBC impartiality than anything. I hope you enjoyed listening to me ramble on. But just watch for it. Watch out for these biases. And when people are telling you something, do a bit of digging around who they are and what their background is and where their minds are at. Because they might not be steering you, giving you the full picture. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care. Cheers. Bye-bye.